and maybe take some notes around the edges, always a good thing to do. And also, as I said, you may find it helpful as well to have the Bible open at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 12 through to verse 26. Well, we're in this new series, the second part of this series we've called The Meaning of Life, where we are learning that the book of Ecclesiastes is one man's search, Solomon who wrote this, but one man's search for meaning in life. That it is Solomon, king of Israel, using all of his resources, all of his wealth, all of his wisdom to sort out what life is all about. And as we saw last week, if you were here last week, this book was written at the closing years of Solomon's life as he looked back, as it were, over his shoulder and evaluated the things that he had tried to experience in order that he might find meaning to life. It begins as this great man of wisdom is searching for the meaning of life in a number of areas. Now, there are three key words in this book. First of all, the word meaningless. You may well have heard that word a number of times through that reading we just went through. It's a word that occurs many times throughout this book, which means emptiness or futility or without meaning. Secondly, the words under the sun. It's the phrase which means this is the context, this is the context in which Solomon is doing his research. And we must understand this, and this is very important to understand in this book. He is not researching life with God in the picture. He is looking at life as if God doesn't exist. And the third word that you'll see time and time again is the word gain, which means that which is left over. And Solomon is going to research these various areas of life, and he's going to find out what is left over. Now, of course, this search for meaning in life is an age-old quest. People everywhere want to live a meaningful life. The question becomes, how do you find it? Now, some look for it in pleasure, some in knowledge, some in self-indulgence, some in work, and others in material things. But Solomon discovered that meaning is found in none of those things. And so, to drive his point home, Solomon describes some of his own experiences under the sun. And the first that he wants us to see here on your outline is the experiences of life under the sun. That's the first thing he wants us to understand. The experiences of life under the sun. And these begin at chapter 1, verse 12, as Solomon determines to search for meaning in wisdom. Look what he says, verses 12 through 18. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. Verse 16. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Now in this section of Ecclesiastes, Solomon examines his search for meaning under four perspectives. The first is this. He says, you cannot find meaning in wisdom. That's the first thing he's discovered. You cannot find meaning in wisdom. Solomon begins by saying that he tried to find meaning in life through his wisdom and through his knowledge and through his great intellectual ability. His evaluation as he goes through this process is that education, as we would call it today, is not the ultimate answer to meaning in life. Was the king anti-education? Not one bit. He was the best educated man of his generation. His wisdom was legendary. He had pursued wisdom wherever it could be found. Yet to his surprise, the more he learned, the emptier he felt. T.S. Eliot once dryly remarked, all our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. In other words, the more we learn, the smaller we feel. Now Solomon here was confused. He pursued education and wisdom and knowledge as no one before him had done. And the fuller he mastered these fields, the emptier they seemed. Listen to Solomon's conclusion about his search for meaning in education, wisdom and knowledge in verse 18. He says, "For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." Consider the sum total of our knowledge, all our progress, all of our technology today. Has any of it really made the experience of life richer? Yes, we're thankful to God for things like medical advances and jet travel and things like that. Most of us have more information on the hard drive of our computers than entire nations once possessed in their ancient libraries. Yet there have never been so many unhappy people. All our accumulated knowledge of history cannot keep us from terrorism and from war and from discord. And all of us have met, perhaps even know, perhaps even are, people with a great deal of education. And if education could bring meaning, the happiest people in the world will be people with PhDs. But you and I know that ain't so. You cannot find meaning simply through education. And one of the things that happens in our secular culture is that we believe that we can change the world through education. Instead, we just create smarter people who know how to do evil in a more sophisticated way. And we don't have meaning at all. Solomon looked for meaning in wisdom. Secondly, he says, you cannot find meaning in wild living. So he tries wisdom, doesn't work. So he's now looking at wild living. And as we begin the second chapter, Solomon continues his search for meaning in wild living. Education proved fruitless for him, but perhaps he'll find what he seeks in reckless abandon. And these verses, as I read them, they sound like a report in one of our tabloid newspapers, don't they? One of these celebrity magazines or whatever they are. Look what it says, verses 1 to 3 in chapter 2. He says, "I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good." But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Now notice, he's searching for meaning, first of all in wisdom, and he says it's like grasping at the wind. Then he decides to try and find out whether he can find meaning through wild living. And he does it through two ways. The first is that he tried amusement. That's the first thing he tries. He tries amusement. One Bible commentator has said this. He says, "There was no time in Israel's history which was rich in possibilities for various pleasures, and no person in a better position to make the most of them than was Solomon." The Bible says that he tried pleasure, and he tried laughter, and he tried foolishness. And he found out that it didn't bring him any happiness whatsoever. Laughter only breaks the monotony of crying, he says. And pleasure is only an intermission to pain. And Solomon was trying to be happy, and he was not. In fact, in one of the 3,000 Proverbs that he wrote, that is recorded for us in the book of Proverbs, he said it this way in Proverbs 14, verse 13. He says, "Laughter can conceal a heavy heart. When the laughter ends, the grief remains." He tried amusement. And you can almost visualize the scene, can't you? His palace in Jerusalem probably resembled a 10th century BC version of one of those casinos you see in Las Vegas. Bright lights, big city, bells and baubles everywhere. But no meaning, no peace, no happiness. The mornings after all looked the same. The possibilities for sensual pleasure were nearly endless in Solomon's world. And who had better access to these possibilities than the king? He had a palace and had all these servants at his fingertips. He had rooms full of wives and concubines, and still he found no fulfillment. He tried his best to amuse himself and found that it didn't work. How many have we known like that in our culture? Perhaps you have been down that road and you could say, I did it all, I tried it all, I experienced everything that the world offers, and it left me with an emptiness in my heart. So he tries amusement, but secondly, he also tried alcohol. You see that? because when amusements failed to satisfy him, so Solomon now turns to alcohol. Look at verse 3. He says, I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind still guided me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Now, please understand, Solomon did not become an alcoholic. He apparently avoided being drunk. He says he was able to keep his mind with wisdom. You notice that? He kept his senses about him so that he could record his observations of the effect of wine taking him towards meaning in life.